It was a crisp Friday evening in Paris, the city alive with the glow of streetlights reflecting off the Seine, the air filled with the faint scent of freshly baked bread and roasted chestnuts from the nearby stalls. Amelie worked at a small, quaint cafe tucked away in a cobblestone alley, the kind of place where tourists often passed without noticing, but the locals cherished. She had been working there for 3 years, perfecting her craft of serving with elegance and patience, even when her shift stretched late into the night. That evening, she was arranging the last few tables outside the cafe, straightening the small bouquets that adorned each one when he walked in. The man carried himself like the world revolved around him. Immaculate tailored suit, polished shoes that clicked with every step, and an air of arrogance that seemed to command attention. He was older, maybe in his early 40s, with sharp features and a gaze that could pierce through anyone's composure. He had that kind of confidence that bordered on entitlement, the kind that often left people around him uneasy. Amelie noticed him immediately, and for a moment she felt a shiver run down her spine, though not from fear. There was something about him, the way he looked at the cafe, as if he owned it already. He took a seat at the corner table, the one with the best view of the street. She approached him with her usual warm smile, careful to hide the small tremor in her hands. "Bonsoir, monsieur. Welcome to Café Lumière. May I take your order?" she asked politely. He glanced at her, an eyebrow raised, as if amused by her presence. "Ah, a waitress who speaks French. How quaint," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Then, almost mockingly, he added in French, "Vous parlez anglais?" Amelie froze for a brief second, her heart pounding. The way he said it was not polite, it was mocking, as if he assumed she was just another immigrant girl who barely understood a word beyond the basics. But instead of flinching, she straightened her back and replied, her French flawless, her accent perfect, each word clear and deliberate. "Oui, monsieur, je parle anglais, français, et un peu d'italien. Comment puis-je vous aider ce soir?" The man blinked, surprised, clearly not expecting such a confident reply. He leaned back in his chair, now studying her with curiosity, as if trying to gauge whether she had any reason to speak like that. "Well, that's impressive, but let's see if your skills match your confidence," he said, smirking. Amelie didn't respond immediately. She simply jotted down his order with precision, repeating it back to him in French and English to ensure there were no mistakes. While she did, she noticed the small details about him. The expensive watch that gleamed in the soft cafe light, the cufflinks engraved with a monogram, the subtle but unmistakable scent of cologne that marked wealth and power. She realized she was dealing with someone who had spent his life thinking money could solve everything, including belittling others to feed his ego. As she walked back to the counter, she felt a spark of defiance. She didn't need to tolerate his arrogance, but she also knew that confronting someone like this directly in front of other patrons could be dangerous if mishandled. She had to be strategic. The cafe filled up slowly, and whispers began to circulate among the other diners. The man at the corner table was a stranger to them, but his behavior didn't go unnoticed. He leaned back, occasionally glancing at Amelie, testing her patience. She served other tables as well, keeping her movements graceful and professional, all the while plotting a subtle way to remind him that arrogance was never a substitute for respect. Finally, the moment came when he called her over again. "You know, I've traveled the world, tasted the best wines, dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, yet your little cafe is quaint, nothing more," he said in English this time, his voice loud enough for a few nearby patrons to overhear. Amelie paused, her pen still poised over the notebook. She looked him squarely in the eyes, her lips curving into a small, calm smile. "Monsieur," she said in perfect English, "sometimes it is the small places that reveal the true character of people, not the grandiose ones you have frequented. Have you ever considered that your wealth may blind you more than it opens your eyes?" The cafe went silent for a brief second, a few heads turning. The man's smirk faltered. No one had ever spoken to him like that in public. Amelie felt a thrill of quiet satisfaction. But she wasn't done. She had only opened the door for what was about to come. As she walked back to the kitchen, she overheard his muttered words, half to himself, half to the waiter nearby. Who does she think she is? He didn't know that this night would change more than just the way he looked at waitresses. It would begin a chain of events that he would never recover from, a sequence of poetic justice that Amelie had been planning ever since she realized that money and arrogance were no match for wit, intelligence, and patience. And in that moment, as she polished glasses behind the counter, Amelie made a silent vow. By the end of the week, he would leave that cafe feeling humbled, not because of anyone else, but because of her. She just had to set her plan in motion. Have you ever encountered someone so arrogant that it almost felt like the universe was daring you to prove them wrong? The following morning, Paris awoke under a soft drizzle, the streets glistening as commuters rushed past the cafes with umbrellas clutched tightly. Amelie arrived early at Café Lumière, carrying her tote bag and a quiet determination that set her apart from the usual morning rush of baristas and servers. She had spent the night thinking, replaying every interaction with the billionaire in her mind. There was no room for mistakes. This wasn't about a petty insult anymore. It was about proving that arrogance had consequences. She had already decided her approach, subtle, precise, and perfectly calculated. She wouldn't humiliate him in front of the crowd just yet. No, she would let him underestimate her completely, let him expose his own flaws while she orchestrated a response that would leave him reeling. First, she needed information. She remembered a detail from their brief conversation. The man had mentioned he traveled extensively, often alone, often staying in luxurious hotels. That was her opening. After clocking in and taking a moment to organize her station, she opened her laptop behind the counter. With discreet keystrokes, she began piecing together what she could find about him online. His name, mentioned once in a careless comment while he adjusted his cufflinks, revealed a trail she could follow. Within minutes, she had uncovered a series of news articles, social media profiles, and interviews that painted a picture of a man who loved control, precision, and recognition. More importantly, a man who underestimated anyone outside his immediate social circle. Armed with this knowledge, Amelie began planning her strategy. She would create a scenario that forced him into a position where his arrogance would be his undoing. The cafe, small and intimate, would be her stage, but the actors in her plan extended beyond its walls. She reached out quietly to a few local contacts she trusted, freelance photographers, a sommelier who owed her a favor, and a former waiter at a rival high-end restaurant who knew the billionaire's routines. Each person was briefed carefully, none knowing the full plan, but understanding the cues to follow. Timing, she knew, was everything. By mid-afternoon, the cafe had begun to fill with the usual lunchtime crowd. Businessmen discussing deals over espresso, students hunched over laptops, tourists snapping pictures of the charming decor. Amelie moved with effortless grace, serving tables while keeping an eye on the corner where she knew he might appear again. And appear he did, as if on cue, striding in with that same confident aura, now carrying a tablet and muttering into a Bluetooth headset about some deal he was closing in London. He barely noticed her as he seated himself, but she didn't flinch. She greeted him as usual with the same polite smile that had set the tone the night before. "Monsieur, welcome back. Would you like your usual espresso or perhaps something different today?" she asked. He looked at her with a mix of amusement and disbelief. "I like a little surprise now and then. What do you recommend?" "Ah, a crack in the armor." Amelie's heart raced with quiet excitement. This was her opening. "I have a rare French blend," she said smoothly. "It is rich, bold, and comes with a hint of something unexpected, just like life. Sometimes she could almost see the wheels turning in his mind. Would you like me to bring it, monsieur?" He nodded, clearly intrigued. As she walked away, she felt a sense of empowerment, but she reminded herself that patience was key. This was the calm before the storm. She prepared the espresso with meticulous care, ensuring the aroma alone would draw attention. Then she moved on to stage the next part of her plan, a subtle, indirect way to expose his arrogance. Meanwhile, he had begun scanning his tablet, barely glancing at the cafe's menu or the patrons around him. That was his mistake, assuming no one had any intelligence beyond serving coffee. Amelie had spent the morning planting hints with her collaborators, a photographer positioned near the window, capturing candid shots of his every gesture, the sommelier discreetly noting the particular blend he favored, ready to provide insider information, and the former waiter positioned to subtly whisper details about the man's past pretentious encounters into conversations he could overhear. Each move was invisible, almost imperceptible, but it built a network of exposure that he could not escape once the time came. When Amelie returned with his coffee, she placed it on the table with care. "I hope this meets your expectations, monsieur," she said, her tone polite but carrying a quiet undercurrent of challenge. He lifted the cup, inhaling the aroma, and for a moment there was no trace of the arrogant smirk he usually wore. She noticed it, the subtle shift, the recognition that someone had anticipated him. But she knew this was only the beginning. To truly humble him, she had to provoke a response, draw out his ego until it became vulnerable. And there, in that small cafe, with cameras positioned discreetly and a plan executed to the last detail, Amelie felt a surge of anticipation. Soon, he would learn that wealth and status could never mask ignorance and arrogance when faced with intelligence, wit, and careful preparation. As she returned to the counter to check on other patrons, she overheard a snippet of his conversation on the phone, his voice tense now. "I don't understand. How did she—" His words trailed off abruptly as he noticed someone taking a photograph in the reflection of the window. His composure faltered, the first crack appearing in the armor of arrogance he had carried so easily for decades. Amelie took a deep breath, centering herself. The next steps had to be executed flawlessly, or all her preparation would be wasted. She had set the stage, and the players were in position. Now, she needed to orchestrate the final act, a display that would teach him a lesson in humility he would never forget. And in that moment, as she polished the counter and adjusted the small vases of flowers on each table, Amelie smiled faintly. She knew the question that would linger in his mind long after the cafe emptied. Would he finally learn that intelligence, grace, and preparation could topple even the most arrogant of men? By the time the evening sun dipped behind the rooftops of Paris, the cafe was bustling with a mix of locals and tourists enjoying the warm glow of lights reflecting off the cobblestone streets. Amelie moved among the tables with her usual grace, keeping a careful eye on the corner where the billionaire sat, now fidgeting slightly in his chair, his confidence visibly shaken. Every subtle glance he gave her revealed that he had begun to realize she was not just another polite waitress, but someone who could outthink him at every turn. She had orchestrated the setup over the last few days with precision, the photographs, the whispered hints, the subtle displays of insider knowledge, all of it built a growing sense of unease in him. He had begun to notice that his every move seemed to be mirrored, captured, or anticipated, though he could not pinpoint how. The arrogance that once insulated him now felt like a cage, tightening with each passing minute. Amelie prepared the next part of her plan, the direct confrontation that would leave him exposed, but carefully framed so that he appeared foolish without her having to raise her voice. She approached his table with the same calm, polite smile, holding a small menu folded in her hands. "Monsieur, I hope you are enjoying your evening," she said softly. "I thought you might like to try a few local selections that are highly recommended. Some have been chosen specifically because they pair well with your taste in wine, and others because they reflect certain experiences you might find enlightening." He looked at her, confused but intrigued. "Enlightening experiences? What do you mean?" His voice carried the faintest edge of annoyance, but also curiosity. Amelie leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice just enough so that only he could hear. "Paris is full of lessons, monsieur. Some are learned in grand hotels and boardrooms, others in small cafes by people who notice what the wealthy often ignore. Would you like to find out which lessons you have been missing?" His smirk returned, but it was forced this time, a mask he used to hide his rising unease. "I suppose I'll see what you mean," he said, waving her off, though his eyes remained locked on her with an intensity that betrayed his curiosity. Amelie left the table, and moments later, one of her carefully planted collaborators, a young photographer, approached from the side, pretending to take photos of the street. But the camera captured the billionaire's every gesture, including his increasingly nervous fidgeting with his cufflinks and the subtle glances he cast around the cafe, as if searching for answers. As the evening progressed, Amelie began to introduce a series of small but deliberate challenges. She served him drinks with subtle notes about provenance and flavor that only someone with her expertise could provide. She made offhand comments about etiquette, culture, and travel that hinted she knew far more than she should have. The careful layering of knowledge, observation, and timing created a psychological pressure that was almost imperceptible but effective. Finally, the moment came when she presented him with a small, delicate dessert on a fine porcelain plate. She had asked the sommelier to prepare a wine pairing designed to provoke him, a rare vintage that required precise temperature, glassware, and serving technique. The billionaire took a sip, expecting the usual luxury experience, only to realize that every detail was perfect, yet subtly highlighted his own ignorance. The wine was exquisite, but he had no idea how it reached that perfection, nor why it made him feel momentarily out of control. Amelie watched him carefully, noting the shift in his demeanor. His confident posture had softened, the smirk no longer present. She leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice once more. "Monsieur, sometimes it takes noticing the details the world considers small to understand the bigger picture. Have you considered that arrogance can blind even the most experienced eye?" He looked up sharply, his expression a mixture of surprise, frustration, and curiosity. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to him in a way that made him question himself, not his wealth, not his power, but his judgment, his assumptions, and his sense of superiority. The cafe seemed to hold its breath as he grappled with her words. Around them, patrons whispered softly, sensing the subtle power shift between the two. He fumbled with his glass, and a bead of sweat formed at his temple despite the cool evening air. Amelie remained composed, her calm presence a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. And then, the critical part of her plan unfolded. The former waiter she had contacted earlier approached with a subtle nod and quietly mentioned something about a luxury hotel the billionaire often visited. The details, carefully orchestrated, revealed an embarrassing oversight he had made in front of his own staff, a flaw he had been blind to, but which now became impossible to ignore. The whispers of recognition and astonishment spread slowly, and he realized that the carefully constructed image of control he maintained had begun to crumble. Amelie observed silently, savoring the moment of poetic justice. Her intelligence, patience, and meticulous planning had forced him into a position where he could no longer rely solely on money and status. Every gesture, every choice, every assumption had been accounted for, and now he was confronted with the reality that the world did not bend to arrogance alone. She leaned back, slightly, letting the final impression linger. His ego, once towering, now appeared fragile under the subtle pressure of observation and wit. The question that lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable, hovered between them. Could he ever truly respect someone who had outmaneuvered him so quietly, so completely, without ever raising a hand or speaking a harsh word? The following evening, Paris was alive with golden streetlights reflecting on the Seine, and Café Lumière buzzed with its usual charm. Amelie arrived early, carrying a quiet determination that radiated through her every movement. Tonight would be the culmination of her plan, the moment when all the subtle pressure she had applied over the past few days would crystallize into an undeniable lesson for the billionaire. He entered precisely at 7, as if expecting his usual comfort and predictability. But tonight he was tense, noticeably less composed than before. Amelie greeted him with her calm, confident smile. "Bonsoir, monsieur. Welcome back. I hope you are ready for an experience that is different from the usual," she said, her voice smooth, almost teasing. He raised an eyebrow, clearly unsettled but trying to maintain his mask of superiority. "Different? Let's see what you mean," he replied, though there was a hint of caution creeping into his tone. Amelie had arranged for every element of her plan to converge at this moment. The sommelier had prepared a rare vintage wine, served at exactly the correct temperature, with a subtle aroma designed to unsettle someone unaccustomed to appreciating subtlety. The photographer positioned strategically to capture the billionaire's every reaction for posterity. Even the small details of the dessert plate were designed to test his attention to detail, something he had always prided himself on, but was now beginning to falter at. Vous êtes prêt pour ceci, monsieur? Amelie asked softly in French as she placed the dessert in front of him, her tone calm, but carrying a quiet challenge. He flinched slightly at the flawless French, realizing that once again, she was not just speaking politely. She was subtly asserting dominance. He tried to dismiss his growing unease, lifting his fork and cutting a piece of the dessert. But as he tasted it, he immediately noticed something different: the balance of flavors, the texture, the subtle hint of a rare spice he had never encountered before. It was perfect, but it highlighted his ignorance. He had assumed his palate and experience would allow him to identify and appreciate it immediately, yet he was baffled. Amelie leaned slightly closer, speaking softly but audibly enough for him to hear. "Monsieur, Paris has a way of teaching lessons to those who assume wealth and status can replace knowledge. Sometimes, even the smallest details reveal truths that no fortune can buy." He swallowed, realizing that her words were not just polite banter. They were a precise articulation of his own shortcomings, delivered with elegance and wit. He tried to respond, but she continued, adding the final layer to her plan. The former waiter subtly approached the table, mentioning casually in French something about a private gala the billionaire had attended recently, where he had boasted of his wealth and influence in front of high society peers. Amelie's collaborators had arranged for some details of that event, humiliating little mistakes, unnoticed by him but recorded by keen observers, to be whispered in his ear at precisely the right moment. Each revelation chipped away at his carefully maintained image, exposing arrogance and ignorance simultaneously. The billionaire's composure began to crumble. He looked around, realizing that he was surrounded by people who knew more about him than he had ever assumed, and none of it came from his money or power. It was Amelie's intelligence, her observation, her patience, and her subtle orchestration that had placed him in this vulnerable position. Amelie finally spoke in English, her words deliberate and precise. "Monsieur, sometimes it takes humility to truly see the world. Not wealth, not titles, not arrogance. Just awareness, respect, and the courage to accept that even someone you consider beneath you can outthink you completely." He sat back, stunned. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mixture of disbelief and begrudging respect. For the first time, he realized that his arrogance had blinded him, and no amount of wealth could compensate for that. Around them, the cafe buzzed softly with the unspoken tension of a lesson witnessed. Patrons sensed the shift, the subtle reversal of power. The billionaire, once untouchable in his own eyes, now sat humbled, aware that his assumptions had been dismantled without any public humiliation, yet completely undeniable. Amelie smiled faintly, a quiet satisfaction radiating from her. She had orchestrated every detail, timed every move, and watched as her careful planning led to this moment. Justice, subtle and clever, had been served, and the arrogant billionaire had no one to blame but himself. As she cleared the table, she left him with a final remark, soft and measured. "In life, monsieur, it is often those who notice the smallest details who hold the greatest power. Perhaps next time you will remember that." He nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of defeat and understanding. In that moment, Amelie realized her revenge was complete, not with anger or violence, but with intelligence, patience, and poise. She had proven that wit and preparation could humble even the most arrogant of men. And as he left the cafe, no words were spoken between them, but one question lingered in the air, an invisible thread connecting them, a question he would carry long after the lights dimmed. Could he ever see the world without arrogance, or had Amelie simply taught him a lesson too subtle to forget? The city lights reflected off the cobblestone streets, and Amelie watched quietly, a small, victorious smile on her lips. Tonight, justice had been served, Paris had witnessed the reversal, and the arrogant billionaire would never underestimate anyone again.